The dashboard clock in Muhammad Ali's silver Cadillac read 11:47 p.m. on that humid June night in 1970 as he cruised down Martin Luther King Boulevard in Atlanta, Georgia, heading home after a late-night training session at the gym, his body still warm from the workout, his mind peaceful and clear in that particular way that only comes after hours of disciplined physical effort. And he was thinking about his upcoming fight, running through combinations in his head, visualizing his footwork, completely lost in the mental preparation that separated champions from mere contenders, when suddenly, the flashing red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror, pulling him abruptly from his thoughts, back into the reality of being a black man driving a nice car through the South in 1970. And even though he was Muhammad Ali, even though he was the most famous athlete on the planet, even though he had fought in front of millions and defeated the best heavyweights in the world, he felt that familiar tightening in his chest. That instinctive fear that every black person in America knows, the knowledge that a routine traffic stop could turn deadly in seconds, that all his fame, all his achievements, all his championship belts meant absolutely nothing to a cop who saw only the color of his skin, and so he did exactly what his father had taught him to do decades ago. He slowed down carefully, put on his turn signal, pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, and waited, his heart pounding not from exertion now, but from something more primal, more dangerous, the simple act of existing while black in America. The officer who approached his window was young, maybe 25 or 26, with the kind of swagger that came from having a gun and a badge and the backing of a system that rarely held cops accountable for their actions. And he walked up to Ali's window with his hand already resting on his service weapon, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness and hitting Ali directly in the face, blinding him temporarily. And before Ali could even speak, before he could ask what he'd done wrong, the officer barked in a voice dripping with contempt and barely concealed aggression. "License and registration, boy, and keep your hands where I can see them." And that word, that particular word that had been used to diminish and dehumanize black men for centuries, landed like a slap, and Ali felt his jaw clench, felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel, felt that familiar anger rising up from somewhere deep in his soul. But he took a breath, forced himself to stay calm, forced himself to remember that responding to disrespect with resistance could get him killed. And he said in the calmest voice he could manage, "Yes, officer, my license is in my wallet in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now. Is that okay?" Because he knew, everyone knew, that sudden movements during traffic stops got black men shot, got them killed, got their families crying on the news while officials talked about how they feared for their lives, and grand juries declined to press charges. The officer, whose nameplate read Daniels, watched with suspicious eyes as Ali slowly, deliberately, carefully reached for his wallet, extracted his driver's license, and handed it over along with his registration. And there was a moment, just a brief moment, when Daniels looked at the name on the license, when recognition seemed to flicker across his face, when Ali thought maybe this would be the moment when things would shift, when the officer would realize who he'd pulled over and the situation would de-escalate. But instead something darker seemed to settle over Daniels' expression, something that looked almost like resentment, like anger, like he'd been personally offended by Ali's existence. And he said, "So you're the famous Muhammad Ali, huh? The one who thinks he's too good to serve his country? The draft dodger, the America hater?" And Ali felt his stomach drop, because he realized that this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. This was going to be something else entirely. This was going to be a confrontation fueled not just by racism, but by political hatred, by the fact that Ali had refused to go to Vietnam, had been stripped of his championship titles, had been vilified in the press as unpatriotic, as a coward, as a traitor. And apparently Officer Daniels had very strong feelings about all of that, and those feelings were about to make this situation exponentially more dangerous. "Officer, I wasn't speeding, I wasn't driving recklessly. Can you tell me why you pulled me over?" Ali asked, keeping his voice level, keeping his hands visible, keeping every movement slow and deliberate. But Daniels ignored the question, instead stepping back from the car, and suddenly, shockingly, his hand moved to his holster, and in one smooth motion he drew his service weapon, a .38 caliber revolver that looked enormous in the beam of the flashlight. and he pointed it directly at Ali's head. And he said in a voice that was somehow both calm and terrifying, "Get out of the car, boy. Get out slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them, and don't make any sudden moves or I swear to God I will blow your head off right here, right now, and sleep like a baby tonight knowing I rid the world of one more knucker who thinks he's better than everyone else." Have you ever had a gun pointed at your head by someone who has the legal authority to kill you and face no consequences? Have you ever felt that particular species of terror that comes from knowing your life could end in the next second, and there would be no justice, no accountability, just another black body, another hashtag, another news story that everyone would forget about in a week? That's what Muhammad Ali felt in that moment, sitting in his car with a loaded gun pointed at his face by a cop who had clearly already decided that Ali deserved to die. And later, much later, Ali would describe this as one of the most frightening moments of his entire life, more terrifying than any opponent he'd ever faced in the ring. Because at least in the ring there were rules, there were referees, there were witnesses, there was some semblance of fairness. But here, on this dark stretch of road at midnight, there was just him and this cop and a gun and a history of black men being killed by police and their killers walking free. And Ali knew, absolutely knew, that if he made one wrong move, said one wrong word, showed even a flicker of the defiance that had made him famous, he would die right here, and Daniels would claim he feared for his life, and that would be the end of the story, the end of Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxer who ever lived, shot dead during a traffic stop and written off as another casualty of his own alleged aggression, his own failure to comply, his own refusal to show proper deference to authority. But Ali did something in that moment that saved his life, something that went against every instinct in his body, every principle he'd ever stood for, every ounce of pride that had carried him through his career. He submitted completely. He raised his hands in the air. He said yes, sir, and no, sir. He moved slowly and carefully. He got out of the car exactly as instructed. He stood with his hands on the hood of the vehicle. He allowed himself to be searched. He accepted every humiliation, every violation of his dignity, because he understood that survival in that moment meant swallowing his pride, meant playing the role that Daniels wanted him to play, meant becoming small and non-threatening and obedient, and it took more strength to do that, more courage to submit to that degradation than it had ever taken to step into a boxing ring and face the hardest punchers in the world. But the real shock was yet to come, because what neither Ali nor Officer Daniels knew was that they weren't alone on that stretch of road, that approximately 50 yards behind Ali's Cadillac, another vehicle had pulled over, a car containing 3 people who would change everything that happened next, and those 3 people were Captain James Mitchell and Sergeants Robert Hayes and Diana Cortez, supervisors from the Atlanta Police Department who had been conducting a routine patrol in an unmarked car, when they'd noticed Daniels pull over the Cadillac and had stopped to observe, which was standard protocol when officers were working alone at night. And from their vantage point, they had seen everything, had seen Daniels approach the vehicle with his hand on his weapon, had seen the interaction escalate, had seen him draw his gun and point it at an apparently unarmed motorist during what should have been a routine traffic stop. And Captain Mitchell, a 30-year veteran of the force who had seen his share of bad cops and knew exactly what he was witnessing, immediately grabbed his radio and called for backup, then grabbed his flashlight and started walking quickly toward the scene, with Hayes and Cortez right behind him, and as they approached they could hear Daniels yelling at Ali, could hear the barely controlled rage in his voice, could see that this situation was seconds away from turning into a tragedy, and Mitchell, to his eternal credit, didn't hesitate, didn't wait to see how things would play out, didn't give Daniels the benefit of the doubt. Instead, he announced his presence loudly and clearly. "Officer Daniels, this is Captain Mitchell. Lower your weapon immediately, that is a direct order." And the effect of those words was instantaneous. Daniels spun around, his face going from rage to shock to fear in the space of a heartbeat, and he stammered, "Captain, the suspect was, I had reason to believe." But Mitchell cut him off with a voice like steel. "I said lower your weapon, officer, do it now and then step away from the vehicle." And there was something in Mitchell's tone, some combination of authority and barely controlled fury, that made it clear this wasn't a request. This was a command. and failure to comply would have immediate and severe consequences. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine not just the fate of Officer Daniels, but would also send shockwaves through the Atlanta Police Department and become a case study in police reform that would be referenced for decades to come. Because Captain Mitchell, having secured the scene and ensured that Ali was safe, turned to Daniels and said something that no black motorist had probably ever heard a white police captain say to a white police officer in the South in 1970. He said, "Officer Daniels, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation into your conduct during this traffic stop. You will surrender your weapon and your badge to Sergeant Hayes. You will be escorted back to the precinct where you will provide a full written statement. And I am personally going to recommend your termination from this department and will be filing a report with the District Attorney's Office regarding potential criminal charges for assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" And Daniels, whose face had gone from red to white to gray, opened his mouth to protest, to explain, to make excuses. But Mitchell held up his hand and said, "I don't want to hear it. I saw everything. We all saw everything. You drew your weapon on an unarmed motorist during a traffic stop without cause. You used racial slurs. You made threats. You violated every protocol and procedure we have, and you brought shame on this badge and this department. Now give Sergeant Hayes your gun and your badge and consider yourself lucky that Mr. Ali is still alive. Because if you had pulled that trigger, I would have made it my personal mission to ensure you spent the rest of your life in prison." The shock on Daniels's face was almost comical. The realization that his actions had consequences, that he wasn't going to be protected by the blue wall of silence, that his career was over, that everything he thought he could get away with had just come crashing down around him. And with shaking hands he surrendered his weapon and his badge, was escorted to the patrol car, and was driven away, leaving Ali standing on the side of the road, still processing what had just happened, still trying to understand how he had gone from having a gun pointed at his head to watching his potential killer being arrested. And Captain Mitchell approached him with an expression that was equal parts professional and deeply apologetic, and he said, "Mr. Ali, I am profoundly sorry for what you just experienced. That officer's conduct was inexcusable, it was criminal, and it does not represent the values of this department or the officers who serve with honor and integrity. I need to ask you some questions and get your statement, and I want you to know that you have every right to file a formal complaint, to pursue legal action, and that this department will cooperate fully with any investigation." What Ali did next would surprise everyone, including himself, because his first instinct was to be angry, to demand justice, to use his platform and his fame to expose what had just happened, to hold a press conference and tell the world about Officer Daniels and the Atlanta Police Department and the systemic racism that allowed cops like Daniels to wear a badge and carry a gun. But as he stood there looking at Captain Mitchell, looking at Sergeants Hayes and Cortez who had come to his aid, looking at these three officers who had done the right thing even though it meant going against one of their own, he realized something profound. He realized that not all cops were like Daniels, that there were good people in law enforcement who genuinely wanted to serve and protect all citizens regardless of race, who were willing to hold their colleagues accountable, who understood that the badge came with responsibility, and that authority without accountability was just tyranny with a uniform. And so instead of anger, instead of demands, instead of threats, Ali did something that would define his character more than any championship he ever won. He extended his hand to Captain Mitchell and he said, "Thank you, Captain. Thank you for your integrity. Thank you for doing the right thing. Thank you for showing me that there are still good people in this world who will stand up against injustice, even when it's not easy, even when it means going against one of their own. You saved my life tonight. And I won't forget that. I won't forget any of this. But I'm not going to make this a public spectacle. I'm not going to hold a press conference or call the newspapers. Because I believe you when you say that officer doesn't represent your department. And I don't want to paint all police with the same brush. I don't want to contribute to more division, more hatred, more mistrust. But I do want you to promise me something. I want you to promise that you'll use this incident to make changes, to improve training, to identify other officers who might be like Daniels before they hurt someone, to create a system where good cops like you can do the right thing without fear of retaliation. Can you promise me that?" What Muhammad Ali didn't know would change history forever, because Captain James Mitchell took that promise seriously, took it as a personal mission, and in the months and years that followed, he would use the Daniels incident as a catalyst for reform within the Atlanta Police Department, would implement new training programs focused on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity, would create an early warning system to identify officers with patterns of complaints or problematic behavior, would establish a civilian review board to investigate allegations of police misconduct, would personally mentor young black officers and help them advance through the ranks, and would eventually rise to the position of police chief, where he would continue to push for reforms and would often tell the story of that night in June 1970, when Muhammad Ali taught him that courage isn't just about confronting your enemies. It's about extending grace to those who fail. It's about believing in the possibility of change. It's about choosing hope over cynicism, redemption over revenge, and about using your platform not to tear down but to build up. And Mitchell would say that the 60 seconds that changed Officer Daniels' life also changed his own, changed his understanding of what it meant to be a police officer, what it meant to serve a community, what it meant to have power and how to use that power responsibly. As for Officer Daniels, he was indeed fired from the Atlanta Police Department. The investigation revealed a pattern of complaints from black citizens that had been ignored or downplayed by previous supervisors, revealed a history of excessive force, racial slurs, and discriminatory policing that should have gotten him fired years earlier, but had been protected by a culture of silence and mutual protection among officers. And the revelation of this pattern sparked a broader investigation that led to the termination or discipline of several other officers and supervisors who had either engaged in similar conduct or had failed to report it. And in this way, that one traffic stop, that one confrontation, that one moment when Captain Mitchell chose accountability over loyalty, became a turning point for an entire police department, became a model for reform efforts in other cities, became a case study in police academies about the importance of ethical leadership and the courage to do the right thing even when it's difficult. But what happened in that dark moment on Martin Luther King Boulevard would become legend for another reason. Because years later, in 1996, when Muhammad Ali stood in Atlanta's Olympic Stadium with a trembling hand holding the torch to light the Olympic flame, when the world watched as this man who had been stripped of his titles for his principles, who had been vilified as a traitor, who had suffered from Parkinson's disease but still stood tall and proud, representing not just boxing but the entire Olympic movement, Captain Mitchell was there in the crowd, tears streaming down his face, thinking about that night 26 years earlier when a scared young cop pulled a gun on the greatest boxer who ever lived, and how the boxer responded not with violence or vengeance but with grace and wisdom, and how that response changed everything, changed lives, changed systems, changed hearts. And Mitchell would later write in his memoir that in all his years in law enforcement, he had never witnessed a more powerful example of true strength than Muhammad Ali standing vulnerable on the side of the road with a gun pointed at his head and choosing not just to survive, but to forgive, not just to escape, but to educate, not just to condemn, but to inspire change. And that this moment, more than any knockout, more than any championship, more than any protest or political stand, revealed who Ali really was at his core. Not just a fighter, not just an activist, not just a celebrity, but a teacher, a healer. A man who understood that the real battle wasn't against individual opponents, but against the systems and attitudes that made men like Officer Daniels possible. And that winning that battle required not just courage but compassion, not just strength but wisdom, not just defiance but grace. And in choosing grace over rage, in choosing forgiveness over revenge, in choosing hope over bitterness, Muhammad Ali showed the world what true championship looks like, and that legacy, forged in a moment of terror and sealed with an act of mercy, would outlive all his titles, all his victories, all his fame, and would remind generations to come that the measure of a man isn't found in how he treats his enemies when he has power over them, but in how he treats them when they have power over him. And that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't fighting back. It's extending a hand, offering a second chance, and believing that people, systems, and societies can change if we have the courage to show them a better way.